All right. Well, happy Tuesday, everyone, and welcome to another Learning Tech Talks, where we are exploring the landscape of all things people, business, and technology. And today we are going to have a conversation about, I think as we were talking backstage, we really landed on where I think the theme is going to go is technical skills for non-technical people, and really talking through what that looks like and why it really matters in the landscape of things. And what we also agreed on is that we are not going to turn this into a conversation about AI. So there is plenty of content out there. I have created plenty myself, but that is not going to be this discussion. This is really going to be around what it means to be a technical leader in a non-technical role. And so to help me navigate that conversation, who better to do that with than Sagi Brody, and he is the CTO and co-founder of Opti9. So thank you so much, Sagi, for joining me.
Thank you. And just to clarify, I was a co-founder of a company called WebAir, which with two other companies turned into Opti9, just for our compliance.
All right. Well, see, there you go. See, we're getting technical on the introduction. So see what I did there? That was nice. So we're getting technical on this, but you are the chief technology officer there, and you've got a lot of experience. And based on what we talked about backstage, I think this is going to be really helpful for folks who more and more in just what I see, regardless of the role you're in, you are making a lot of technical decisions. You're having to decide about technology products that you're bringing in. And we're going to talk about the risks that comes with that and some of the skills that you need to bring along with that to do that well. But Sagi, before we do, a little bit of background on you. And I mean, you obviously co-founded multiple companies. Now you're the chief technology officer at Opti9. What is your background and how did you end up where you are?
I always loved to tinker with computers and just program and build things. And as I was going to college, I had an internship at a local IT company running their servers for $6 an hour or whatever. I met who would later become my co-founder of a company called WebAir, and we were kind of in the right place in the right time, late 90s. A lot of our friends were having some websites designed and needed a place to host it. If you think of like the GoDaddy type services now, they're pretty ubiquitous. Back then,
back in the day, it was not. It was a little bit different.
Oh yeah, it was completely different. And so we really started as a hosting company. Back then it was all open source software. It was all do it yourself. There was no support contracts. The technology was bleeding edge, the software that you needed to run to get these websites to work and to scale. And it was all, seat of your pants. And we scaled it. And as our customers' businesses grew and their websites became more successful, we had to scale the back end and kind of roll with the punches. And we went from that to, and that was in the late 90s. And then we kind of, the industry and the market matured. And then we ended up focusing more on enterprise types of workloads and use cases in public cloud and all that. And today, Opti9 is really more focused on management of public clouds, management of backups as a service, disaster recovery implementations, hybrid cloud, really taking ownership of those things for our customers because they've just gotten so complex that they pass it along to us and we handle all the details for them.
Okay. So if anybody watching or listening, and by the way, those of you who end up watching or listening, feel free to ask questions along the way. I want to, continue to encourage folks who I know folks tend to tune in and then alt tab and listen to it. But if you have questions, or if Sagi says things like that you go, I don't even know what he just talked about, that's fine, because we're actually going to demystify that for you. But one of the things I'm actually really curious about going back down that trip down memory lane is I know exactly what you're talking about back in the early or late 90s timeframe, when even some of the things that today I think people take for granted that seem so simple. I just think of even setting up a website now. My children could do it, which back then my children could not do that. The technical level of expertise that went into even some things that we take for granted now was significantly different. Was that something that just always, were you just naturally drawn to that more technical nature of things? Was that just a natural thing for you, or did you just fall into it?
Yeah, I think that it is natural. And I think it touches upon different ways that people learn. right? And for me, it was always about sort of getting my hands on something and breaking it so that I understood how it worked, or breaking it 3 or 4 times. In fact, that's not just an analogy. I was fortunate enough, the first PC that I got when I was 13 or whatever, it was a compact, and thank God they had a great warranty, because I play a video game, it would get slow, do some research, need more memory, need a bigger hard drive, and
Yep.
bought it myself. Went to whatever the store was.
Comp USA or
Comp USA. There was one other, I think, that outlived them a little. I can't remember the other one's name, but what happened was I'd buy these components, I'd open the computer, I'd install them, and then it wouldn't turn on. And turns out I kept buying my motherboard. And they had a great warranty. They'd send me a new motherboard or computer or whatever, like multiple times, like in a year. And so I was kind of learning on their dime. But I think sometimes you just gotta tinker with things. If you want to go way back, I'd probably even attribute some of it to Legos. Just building, kind of creating something out of nothing. To me, that's
putting things together.
Yeah.
Okay. So kind of a systems thinker, like to deconstruct things, which I can very much relate to that. I love that kind of stuff. And actually that was my path, was very similar. I remember my uncle was into this stuff, and he sent me my first Pentium 133. It was my own personal computer. It was an IBM, fancy stuff back in the day. But I remember that, where you could actually swap your hard drives. And granted, you can still do some of that stuff today, but I agree. It was a very, some people steered clear of it. But with that, similarly, I'm guessing that you've seen now that transformation of how things have changed over time, because some of those things we talk about now feel like, if you said, I used to be into, working a switchboard, where people be like, you do say what? I was a lamplighter type of a thing. I remember the days where there would be and I grew up in a small town, but you'd have a small town person, and they were like your local PC hardware repairman, and you would bring them in, and they'd run crap cleaner, and they defrag your hard drive. And like, that was a thing, because you brought it to the technical person who defragged your hard drive and put in a couple RAM sticks to try and boost the speed of your computer. And there were whole, local companies built on that. And now we're in more of a disposable industry, where it's like, well, computer's out, chuck it, buy a new one type of a thing. And I see the same thing happening with skills. So I'm curious your take on how that has affected some of the skills that are required by technical. What things have faded into the sunset, and what things have you seen really still stay durable amidst that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think that what's definitely the case is that folks that are getting into IT now, maybe getting into application development, or work in an IT function in a larger organization, they're focused on a layer, way up here. They're running their applications, and they don't really need to know much about, let's say, networking, the way that traffic is passed across the internet. They don't need to know anything about the processor or assembly. These are all sort of foundational things that if you went to school for computer science, you kind of were forced to learn all these low-level foundational languages and all this stuff. And
I remember taking a computer repair class. I took a computer repair class in high school.
Yeah, and I think in many ways they don't need to know those things, because all these industries have been built to make these things easier to consume, and time to market to be low, and to be able to create things without knowing all those things. And that's good. On the flip side, I think that inevitably you kind of deal with an issue, or you need to troubleshoot something, and you kind of need to pull some of those skills out of a hat. And so I think there are still some foundational skills that you need to understand from a high level. You don't have to learn them inside and out, but certainly I think networking is one of them. I'll give you a great example. There's a lot of folks getting into cybersecurity, and I find it difficult to become a cybersecurity expert, or go to school to become a cybersecurity expert with not knowing how, a programming language, or not knowing how networking works. Because if you think about it, the hackers on the other end of the fence, they know all those things. In order to be a really good hacker, I feel like you need to know, you got to have that wide range of skill sets. And so if your job is to defeat the hacker, you got to know those as well too. And so can you get a career as a cybersecurity analyst and use some off-the-shelf software and just sort of run that software properly and read the alerts? Sure. But if you want to be that layer 3, layer 4 escalation point, the senior person, that point you're going to need to learn those low-level skills.
Okay. Well, and yeah, Justice, I like your comment. It is this, I was actually going to, because initially where you were going with it was some of these things are sunset and I don't think people need to know them anymore. And I was going to push back on you on it, but you came full circle a little bit, because I do think there is, and I don't know what that right line is. And hearing you talk about it from a technical standpoint, because it is very difficult. And I even see this now, and again, we're not going to talk about AI, but I see this with AI where there's some of these things that I think it's going to take from people that maybe they really had no business doing anyway. And it's great. It's freeing up time. It's making their lives easier, all this other stuff. But by doing so, are we taking things away from people that they even understand what was happening underneath it at some foundational level? Maybe you didn't need to know all the intricacies of it, but by not even fundamentally understanding how it works, do you have the ability when something goes wrong to problem solve or know how to react? And that's one of the things that from a technical standpoint, I was curious, and it was interesting to see how you highlighted that. So have you found where that right level is? Like even in your background?
I think I think it really depends on your use case, and a lot of this does. Like, what are you doing, or what are you working on? And so, going back to the website creation example, like if you're creating your own startup and you're trying to get an MVP or a simple website up and running to demonstrate what your business does, you can use an online like application builder, website builder, and that might get you pretty far, but at some point you're going to have to go back.
You're going to reach a threshold where where Squarespace and Wix isn't going to be good enough for maybe a full-blown enterprise website.
I mean, what's the alternative? Like you learn and you build forever and nothing ever gets done. But I think to answer your question more directly, I do think that having gone through some of those sort of foundational skill learning, one of the best things that you learn is the ability to troubleshoot systems and the ability to think logically. And that I think people don't put enough effort on troubleshooting as a standalone skill. And by troubleshooting, there's going through strategies like, can I, if I have a problem with or an issue with an application or a bug, can I reproduce, can I reproduce it? Can I
replicate it?
Yeah. And then how do I isolate it? How do I localize it? Let me make a change, but let me not make 5 changes at once. The great thing about some of those strategies is they transcend the shiny object syndrome of the day or the Kool-Aid of the day. In fact, if you're really good at something like that, you can walk into an issue that others might not have, that can't fix. And they might know much more about the issue than you do, but because you're sort of thinking in that very logical way, you might be able to localize the issue quicker. And so you can learn that in a variety of different ways.
Okay. I thought there was a second half to that sentence, but because what's interesting about you saying this is, so my background, I ended up pivoting because I was in the technical space, thought it was interesting, but was more interested in the intersection of people and tech. Like, where does that intersection play? And what you just described in terms of that critical thinking, problem solving skill was a very transferable skill. The way I would diagnose and figure out, okay, going back to our PC repair days here, this is something we can both resonate with. When you put that new stick of RAM in and you flip the switch and it didn't turn on, learning how to go, okay, what just happened right there? Let me take it out and see if it turns on. Okay, now it still turns on, or it still doesn't turn on. So what did I do? And actually started diagnosing that. That actually transferred very well over into the people challenges, because in similar systems type thinking, there was some real credibility to being able to look at the problem, deconstruct it into pieces, and put it back together. And I think what you're getting at is some of these transferable skills that aren't necessarily purely IT skills.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the medical industry and you go to medical, I mean, we can't fix a computer. Okay, no big deal. But you misdiagnose something in the medical field, forget it. That's someone's life.
Somebody's dead.
Yeah. Yeah. And they do, I think, what they call bedside clinics, right? Where they all kind of go into a patient's, room and talk about, are we focused on the symptom, or the root cause? And it's funny because sitting in sort of the troubleshooting seat, being on the other side of tech support calls, many years ago, it's funny because sometimes people will sort of pre-diagnose something. They'll call you and they'll tell you something's wrong, but they're telling you one of the sort of symptoms, right? And so you might go hyper focused down a rabbit hole and not realize that they didn't give you the big picture. They didn't give you all the context. And so you need to have the discipline to ask all the right questions and to obtain that context first.
Okay. Well, this actually transitions well into something else I wanted to bring up when we were talking about this, which is this whole getting to the root of what are you really trying to do with. And I think in the technical space, but not just the technical space, for the general audience who is now making more technical decisions, what you just described right there, in my opinion, is one of the catastrophic things I see in organizations where they aren't clear and they think they're solving a problem, but really they're solving a symptom of a problem. And that's where big decisions are made. People are chasing things for technical solutions, not realizing that, wait, you just bought something that solves a symptom, but it actually didn't solve a problem. And people don't discover this till much later down the process.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, there's a lot of that going on today. The cloud is probably the best example. People have all these great assumptions. If I move to the cloud, then I never have to worry about anything. And it's not their fault. The great thing about these vague technical terms like the cloud or managed service or even AI to an extent is that they work in the favor of the vendors who can sort of redefine them however they want to fit into their vision. And what I say the cloud is might be different than 4 of my competitors. And who cares about what we say, but where it really comes out is what the customer's expectations should be. I'll give you a good example of this is, years ago, everyone used to run their own email servers, and most organizations that was an Exchange server. And then, a lot of that went to folks moving that to Microsoft 365. And in many ways, that was a really good decision because no longer do you have to manage your own server and the security of it and all that. But people make an assumption. If I move that, now Microsoft, and not to pick on Microsoft, it's not an issue with them, but now they will handle the servers and the data centers and the infrastructure. But what a lot of people don't realize is there's no backups built into that platform. If you have a need to back up your email with Microsoft 365, that's something you need to do yourself. Most people don't realize that. They just assume that Microsoft backs it up. And again, it's not a Microsoft issue. It's really just about people not understanding what they're buying. And so the consumers need to be
I think I just heard all my audience run and call their IT person right now and ask, or were we aware of that? That might have just been the wind in my ear, but
absolutely. Absolutely. We use the cloud, therefore we're safe from X, Y, and Z. And the problem is that people have a false sense of security. Maybe they're at home and they see a commercial on TV about some cybersecurity company or whatever, or a news article about ransomware. And what pains me is there's some executives sitting at home and like, I don't need to worry about that because we're buying X, Y, and Z. And maybe they're buying one solution, but it's not covering their entire ecosystem. And so there's a lot of sort of, false sense of security out there, and people really need to just ask more questions. The beautiful thing about technology is that you can't find me one person out there on the planet that knows everything that there needs to know about tech. And so it is not wrong to ask questions. What does that mean? What should my expectations be? How do you accomplish that? I do it all the time. And so even the most technical people that are out there should be asking questions about how all these things are working.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I've seen a lot of more technical people in my circles do, that I'm not saying that other industries don't do it as much, but it is more in the lifeblood of the culture of technical fields that I work with, is ask questions. It seems to be much more cultural to just go, hey, like, I'm trying to figure, have you solved this? There's Reddit threads or whatever, other threads where people are asking this, digging into, how have other people solved this? Now, maybe that's just my perception based on the people that I'm interacting with, but it seems much more of a common thread to be able to say, there's no way I could possibly know everything there is to know about this because of how vast and complex it is. And so I observe that people don't often go with the assumption that, oh, I know everything there is to know about this, because there's this keen awareness to the fact this is way bigger than I could ever have in my head. And so I have to tap into that broader network.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think part of it is, as we mentioned before, some of the tech folks are just natural tinkerers, and they just genuinely enjoy knowing, how other people are solving technical problems, or they just want to learn. And there's a resource sitting in front of you. I mean, that's one of the cool things is, like, if you're being pitched by companies who are trying to sell you technical solutions, one way to look at that is, these are people that are calling you willing to teach you things for free, and have, X number of phone calls with you. And so I don't mind it when vendors try to pitch me, because, they are a resource, and, inevitably they probably know more about a certain topic than I do. So it's not an issue. The other thing too is, the terminology is so vague and to an extent not standardized that you almost need to ask the questions is, okay, so you're selling me a cloud or a security solution. So what is your definition of that? In your vision of the world, what does that look like? And what are your deliverables to me, in an ongoing basis or during onboarding, and what should my expectations be of that product? Should it be resilient? Should it be able to sort of live on through some sort of outage or downtime or disaster? Those are all very sort of natural questions to ask, and they're not technical in nature.
So let me ask you this, because there's two things you said that I agree with and would encourage anybody watching or listening to take into consideration on this. Is one, I actually started this show because of what you just described, which was there's this tendency to not want to engage with vendors. And to be fair to the vendors listening to this, there are plenty of bad practices out there that I think contribute to this.
Absolutely.
When it's one of these, like, hey, I literally just set up a meeting and now I've got junior deputy salesperson calling me every week asking, like, what are next steps type of a thing. There are certain things that I understand where people get a little like, I don't enjoy that. But I started this show because me personally, I've always enjoyed engaging with vendors for the very reason you described. Like, what are you seeing? How are you thinking about? Why did you come up with the solution in the first place? How are you actually architecting it to be able to solve some of these things? Knowing that it may not necessarily be a solution, but seeing it more as a relationship that at some point may come to fruition. And if it doesn't, we've just helped each other out along the way. And I think that's something that I would encourage lots of other people to do, because there is tremendous value in what you just described. My question for you, though, on this that goes back a little bit further is you talked about people not necessarily being clear on, and I think there's two stages. So I want to go through the first stage first, which is being clear on what the root issue is versus a symptom. Have you encountered ways to help people through that conversation? Because that's not always, my experience has been, that's not always an easy conversation to navigate when somebody's convinced, no, this is the problem, and that it's not the problem, it's the symptom, but you almost have to bring them around to that. Have you had success or things that you would say, here's something that works really well on that?
I don't know that I have a go-to answer. What I would say is that, you need to have context, right? You can't troubleshoot a system in a bubble, certainly one that, it's interacting with other systems. So you need to understand what the environment and the landscape is, and what the bigger picture looks like. So if it's an application, where is that application running? What type of infrastructure? A good example of this is with sort of networking, right? So going back to the web hosting days, if we had a customer that would call us and say, my website is slow, is it our infrastructure? Is it the server, or is it their network connection? And so we kind of need to rule out other things and then see what we're left with. If there is a good strategy, it's probably that. Look at the environment, look at all the different sort of systems that are in play, and start ruling things out. And so an example of that is, maybe we'd have them run some sort of network test application to test the speed of their local network, right? And no, it's not us, it's you. It's your network. Not only are you having slowness to your application that we host, you're having slowness everywhere. And so, that's the issue. So I think in general, it really just comes down to localization and ruling things out.
Okay.
And I'll tell you something, I'll tell you something funny. We had one customer, and, a lot of it's about asking the right questions. We had a customer that says, no, well, my website's not working right. And I'm like, okay. And before I jump in to start troubleshooting, it's like, my website's not working right. And, some people might just, instinctually, or I'm going to go log in. I'm going to go through my list of what to check. And the first thing I said to him was, I'll never forget it. I'm like, well, what's the problem? And he said, well, the problem is the money is not making its way to my pocket. And it's funny because in his mind, like, that's the only thing he cares about. And so, super abstract. And I'm like, all right, well, let's work backwards from that, and let's localize all the way back.
So what's great about that story, and I laugh about it because what you just described, I think, is one of the biggest. You said it without saying it, and I would advocate this myself. In my experience, has been the best thing you can do is ask really good questions and be relentlessly curious about this stuff, and not in a condescending way, but in just a genuine clarifying, trying to gain understanding, trying to get that bigger picture, and asking really thoughtful, meaningful questions about it. Because even we talked earlier about the fact that a lot of these technical terms are very ubiquitous. They're just everywhere, and they mean a lot, but they also mean nothing depending on who you're talking to. And if you don't take the time to ask those thoughtful questions, you can run down a path thinking, oh, I know what Sagi means, and so I'm going to try and solve that. And you forgot to take the time to ask the question, like, what does that actually mean to you? What do you mean when you say it's not working? And suddenly you get that clarity and go, oh,
yeah.
Oh, okay. Now I understand we're on the same page
Mm-hmm.
of what you're actually talking about. Now we can actually diagnose what the real problem is, where I have seen people with that action bias jump to action thinking they're solving a problem that they bring it back to even the stakeholder and go, here we go. And I see this internally all the time. Hey, we solved your problem. And they're like, what is this? Like, this isn't what I was looking for in the first place. Well,
Yeah.
you said this. That's not what I meant.
It's very easy to go down rabbit holes. I mean, just thinking back, troubleshooting issues, maybe logging into a server and seeing, or helping others troubleshoot. They've escalated to me, logging into a server and, the CPU is at 100%, it's pegged. And maybe someone's focusing on that for an hour. The CPU's pegged, and they're having slowness. And I'm like, okay, well, was it pegged yesterday? Was it pegged a week ago? Yeah. Okay. Well, was it slow then? No. Okay. So that's not your problem. Cross that off your list. Don't go down that rabbit hole. And actually, just going back to something you said before about asking vendors questions, I just want to point out that oftentimes I'm on the other side of that. Where I'm on calls trying to sell our solution to potential customers, and the process of doing that for me has been extremely valuable. By getting those questions asked and getting people just sort of, throwing these, landmines at you. Well, what about this? And what about that? And how are you guys going to deal with this and that? And there's a lot of great questions that just, I didn't consider, and they get the gears, turning, and they actually change what our services look like. And having that feedback loop is just invaluable for product leaders. If you're focused on building a product and you're not getting the feedback from the customers, the questions, you're not going to be effective.
The fact you bring that up, it goes back to what I said before about why I think it's so important for practitioners to engage with the vendor community on a regular basis. And that really was the mission I set out on when I did this, was to say, how do we bridge the gaps between these two? because I do see this a lot where it's easy on the practitioner side to throw shade and point fingers at vendors and go, well, it doesn't do this. And there have been times I've gone, have you told them that? Have you had that conversation and actually said, well, here are the challenges or the limitations that I'm seeing based on our environment? Well, no, but well, they're not going to fix it based on what? Intrinsic wisdom that they know that's what you're dealing with. And I think it is one of those things where the number of times I've either taken things from a conversation and gone, wow, that changes the way I think about things based on what you've shared about system architecture or something you've seen in another organization, but also the gift back of going, well, but here's the realities of the landscape that we're dealing with. And here's just why, technically speaking, it doesn't work. And that's influenced product design. They've changed the product roadmap for different things based on some of that stuff.
Yeah, we've done that. I mean, we've, a large part of our feature sets and what we're doing is just, dictated by our customers. And, we've always embraced bigger customers. The larger the enterprise, the more skeletons in the closet, the more legacy infrastructure, and the more complexity. And that's okay, because if we can make them happy, if we can deal with that scenario, then we can deal with much smaller ones. So we've embraced it, and we've had some really great customers that we add a feature to the product, and now everybody can benefit from it.
So related to where we're talking about these great questions, okay? Because I talk to a lot of folks who aren't as technically savvy and feel uncomfortable with it. So this is where I am sensitive to the practitioner side. If you're not technical, if you didn't grow up assembling your PCs or coding HTML back in the day, and it's not your go-to, which there's a lot of folks that's not the way their brains are wired. It's not the way they work. And it can be very intimidating. And I will say, even as what I consider relatively technical person, it can be intimidating. I'm curious, you mentioned it earlier, that sometimes it can be challenging because you may not even know the right questions to ask. And I'll share a story of a time that I was in this situation, and it was almost catastrophic. I was in the midst of a system implementation, enterprise-wide, major implementation. We'd gone down the path, and going back to something that we'll talk about, which one quick call out, if all you're doing is looking at an RFP checklist and going, it checks the box, so I'm sure it's fine, right? That's mistake number one. But we'd gone much deeper than that, had gone all the way through this thing, and we got to the almost finish line. And we discovered, and I say we because it was missed on both ends, we discovered that the single sign-on protocol, apparently there's two different ones. And the single sign-on protocol that their platform worked off of, it didn't work off the second one. It only worked off ours. And the way our organization was the opposite. Mm-hmm. And it was just a complete disconnect where you go, I don't even know how we fix this. And it goes back to one of those, you can have experiences like that, and it can lead you to go, see, that I just would have never known to ask that question. How do you encourage people in that area? Because I know I've had my way of navigating that, but there are times where you just don't know the questions to ask, and things do get missed and mistakes happen.
Yeah. That is a really good question. I would ask, I think that one important component to understand with that is that for many of the technical solutions that are out there, a lot of them are pretty sort of bleeding edge, and there might not be a standard way that they are all sort of configured or built or delivered. And so when you're asking the questions, it's not, the question should not only be, do you support this? Or do you provide this? It should be, okay, cool. Well, how do you deliver that? What does that look like? Again, what should my expectations be? I would want to know that. Demonstrate for me how you accomplished one of the goals that we have. And so, and that's unfortunately, like when you're on the other side answering RFPs, if you see like your example question, do you support single sign-on?
Single sign-on.
Like,
you're right.
Listen, anybody, almost any vendor out there can spin it and say, yeah, of course, because we have this one type of, in their head, they're justifying why they can answer yes.
Yep.
And you need to know that justification. So it shouldn't be do you, it should be how do you, how do you satisfy this need? And there needs to be, a description. And, you don't always need that, but the more you ask those questions, the more you'll discover, and it just makes you a better educated buyer. But the onus is on the vendor, right? The vendor needs to answer all those questions. And I think it's totally applicable for the buyer to ask them. The other thing too is that, there are some organizational requirements that sort of transcend specific technologies. For instance, as an organization, you might have some standards around security, say cybersecurity. Okay. You might have listed out a framework that you adhere to, or maybe you adhere to a HIPAA or SOC or whatever, or maybe you've sort of built a strategy for your network or how your users connect. You have a sort of responsibility to ensure that all of the things that you buy or services that you consume can sort of be a good participant in those sort of frameworks for your organization. These services that you consume, they shouldn't be an exception to a rule or a one-off. For instance, if you need to ensure resilience or that your services never go down, you can't have random business units running off and consuming, SaaS platforms on their own without sort of first understanding if we go and use this, to what extent does it inhibit our ability to ensure that we can conform to our cybersecurity framework or to our network? And so, you got to ask those questions if you have those standards.
Well, because to your point, even on this, and I've seen this happen where functions of a group or someone go off on a path, they purchase a SaaS, not taking into consideration even that business continuity and uptime and things like that, and not recognizing that we just purchased this platform, it went down and took our whole business with it. I mean, there was one specific example that comes to mind where a product launch, multi-million-dollar product launch, was built on a platform that had not gone through the traditional IT channels and just so happened to crash on product launch day. And it cost the company millions of dollars, which we're going to get to some of the security risks or the consequences of this. But before we do on that, in terms of walking that line with things and this goes back to, I talk to a lot of folks where IT can be seen as a barrier, and I get it. And I have a healthy tension with IT. We have a great relationship, but I have also always had a healthy tension with where that level of risk sits. And certain people have a high risk aversion. Some have a very low risk aversion. What would be your feedback or thoughts on the comment of when is it appropriate to say, you know what, maybe this is a healthy risk. We want to experiment with something and just see what it might be. And when is it one of those like that is going to potentially lead to insurmountable consequences that you'd want to go down? Because I do see in organizations where I've seen both ends of the spectrum. Some organizations are just so hyper locked down. It's almost impossible to innovate and experiment and try different things from a technical standpoint. But I've seen the other side where it's the Wild West and they let people just run free on this, and it leads to serious consequences. Have you seen any guiding principles that help navigate that?
Yeah, I agree. I think both extremes are bad, and finding the middle ground is I think it's something that each organization needs to kind of figure out on their own. But some of the strategies you can employ are obviously having lab environments, obviously rolling something out for non-critical business units, not using production data, setting a meeting a few months out to kind of review it. I think it's dangerous, right? You start playing with something, and before you know it, it becomes an integral part of your production stack without you realizing it, right? And so even just going through a regular risk review process and sort of just knowing where things stand is important. I think the big risk is not knowing the risks and not knowing to what extent these disparate things are part of your critical infrastructure. One strategy that I would employ in general is really to look at complexity itself as a bad thing in relation to IT. I think one of the roles of IT leaders today and one of the goals should be to attempt to reduce the complexity of their technology stack. Not have to go out and buy more things if you don't need to. The more complex your IT environment is, inevitably, the more challenging it's going to be to
manage it.
Secure it, to monitor it, to ensure there's no data leakage, to ensure that it's working. And so by just trying to keep your footprint smaller, you will just, sort of help everything, right? And so focus on managing the complexity. Complexity is really the killer.
Okay. Well, and going back with that, the two things that you hit on, well, there's one specifically that stood out that I really liked the point with this. And I think this would be my advice to anybody listening who's not in the technical space is I've always found building a close relationship with my technical partners has been a huge help, because then you have, going back to a lot of the things we've talked about, the success of it is relational in nature. It's about having that relationship where you can have a dialogue, where you can actually start asking some of these questions around, well, what is the complexity of this? Like, what are we actually thinking about? How are we thinking about using these kinds of things? And actually digging into that versus, and I think this is one of the risks of where, and again, I said it's not an AI conversation, but I think where we run some risks as we start automating some of this stuff. And if we take it too far, we can lose some of this stuff where we can become almost overly bureaucratic and robotic in some of the things. And we lose some of this where, yeah, you might shoot for, well, we want to optimize to move things through our process this quickly, but it's like, but at what expense? And where is the human in the loop on that to be able to have that dialogue? Because there are lots of times in my experience where after a dialogue with our IT partners, we've been able to come to some agreement that, okay, how are we doing this? What are we thinking? What really is the plan behind this? What level of risk? And we do that together and then make a decision collectively on how we want to approach it. But the part that you added that I think is really fantastic on this is that follow-up checkpoint to say, where are we now? And being intentional about that. Because I've seen skipping that step throw things like off the rails, where something that maybe initially got through, or somebody even just well-intentioned like, well, I'm not going to involve IT in this right now because we're just doing a light, pilot experiment type of a thing. And they think it's here, but nobody ever checks back in on it. And it starts to grow and become part of the critical infrastructure to an organization that nobody knew. And then suddenly you look back on it and go, well, whoa. How did it get to this point? Because there wasn't that intentional stop point where you're actually reflecting back going, where are we today? Where are we thinking this is going to continue? And now what things do we need to make sure we account for?
Yeah. And so agreed. And so if as an organization, you have a mandate, let's say, to ensure resilience, your applications don't go down, or let's say data sovereignty, that your data can't live outside a certain region or country, some of those things you can't go back later and impose on some of these platforms. You just can't. And so you do sort of need to ask these things at the onset, at the beginning, and then maybe move forward with some testing beyond that. But I like what you said. It's funny. It's always the last 10% of a project that nobody wants to complete, and is just super critical. I think in the IT world, it's always the same thing. It's documentation. Good documentation, which being a good technical writer is a completely different conversation. But that is a skill, another skill that will transcend the language of the day or whatever's popular, and one that you can take pride in. You should be able to take pride in documenting something that you implemented or built, so that if someone else gets a call at 4 a.m. when you're on vacation, they don't need to call you. I mean, that is a standalone skill that is just critically important. People forgot about it. Last 10%, the documentation, the monitoring, adding it to risk assessment, sheets, telling your security company to monitor it, right? Like if you are paying a security vendor out there a lot of money every month to ensure that your organization is safe from cyber attack and not going to get hacked or whatever, then if you start using another platform, you probably want to call them and let them know to monitor that too.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, it's unfortunately a lot of these things don't come to light until there's an outage or a breach or something, and it's too bad.
Well, and I think this goes back to this shared accountability that is at play with this, where it goes back to relationships and it
Yeah.
goes back to actually building those partnerships and laying down your own swords of your own agenda and saying, hey, can we work together on this? And I think that is such a going back to skills. This whole thing was like about what are the skills that really transcend this stuff. To me, that's one of those really critical skills. And for my own career has helped me significantly is being able to build those cross-functional relationships where you recognize we have each other's six. We're both just trying to do the right things. And how do we give and take to help get each other across the line? Because that's when that stuff, the last place you want to be is, like you said, a breach, or you get nailed in an audit by something. And now you're backing into it going, how did this happen in the first place? And it was like, well, we kind of went down a path. We didn't really want to bring you into the loop, and trust is broken and the consequences can be fatal.
Yeah, and yeah, so and that is certainly the case in the technical world. Years ago when we would market our services, we'd be talking about bits and bytes and how many CPUs and memory and all that. Today, it's really talking about ownership and accountability and expectations, and that comes down to relationships. And it counts when you need it, when you're in trouble, and that's why we give out our cell phone numbers and we build relationships. And there are some vendors that are out there who are focused on just sort of selling cookie cutter services, transactional business. And that's great, and there's certainly many organizations that are looking for that. And there's other vendors who are more bespoke and have an appetite to customize. And for some companies, they're going to align better with that because they need that. And so, there's no one good vendor, just like there's no best cloud out there. Sometimes people say, what's the best cloud? There is no best cloud. No, there is no best vendor. It's what's important for you. And taking a step back, I think the most important thing is as a company or as an IT team sitting down and sort of thinking about what do you have an appetite to take ownership for internally? What do you want to manage versus what do you want to outsource? And the line is drawn differently for different organizations. For some people, they're like, we want our IT to add business value. We don't want them managing infrastructure. And for others, they can add business value unless they're managing the infrastructure. So there's no way that you can manage the complexity on your own, and inevitably some things will need to be outsourced. And so understanding what your strategy is there and what your expectations should be will help you kind of back into what types of vendor you want to look for.
So you naturally dovetailed into where I was going to go with this, because some of the things you just hit on right there, I think are sometimes people get frustrated with the answer. I answer a lot of questions with, well, it depends.
Sure.
Because that's the truth of things. It's rarely a binary this or this type of situation. And I run into that all the time with technical questions about workplace technology. Well, what is the best 3-letter acronym for an organization? And my response is always, well, I don't know. Because I need to understand what really is important to you, because it may not be this one is categorically better than this one, because I don't know what specifically you're prioritizing and how you're weighting different things. And I think what you're talking about hits on that very same thing. Well, maybe it does make sense to outsource this capability in your organization because the transactional nature and the risk associated with it is extremely low. And so from an impact to the organization, it makes absolute sense to outsource that component of it. In another organization, they may say, no, that is our driving value proposition. And if we do that, the risk we associate with that is vastly too high. And it's not that one team is making the wrong choice and the other's making the right. It's just the fact that this is distinctly dynamic in terms of what your situation is, how you're prioritizing. And as you said, what is the strategy of your organization, and how are you prioritizing accordingly?
Yeah, and I think there's also folks out there that almost sort of pre-disqualify some solutions. They think their organization is special. We can't. I've heard it many times in my industry, and we sell managed cloud, we sell disaster recovery. Well, we can't use that. We're too complex. We have too many interesting requirements. You're right. You probably can't use some of the solutions, but there are vendors that specialize in that. We had a state attorney, talked to us about disaster recovery, and the first thing they said was, well, we can't use the cloud. We have unique requirements. Well, what are they? Well, we store evidence. That evidence can't cross state lines, therefore can't use cloud. I'm like, well, we can provide you with cloud and it doesn't leave the state and it's privately connected. Is that cool? Oh yeah, we didn't know that was an option, right? And so I think people are pre-disqualifying, which is similar to sort of like the pre-troubleshooting. And there are different vendors out there that cater to those different needs.
Yeah. Well, and this goes back to going back to something we talked about very early on. And actually the book I wrote is about this, which is about getting to the core of what your intention is. What are you really trying to accomplish first? Start with that, because to your point of pre-disqualifying things, the number of times I've been in situations where I've heard, I just think back to my pharma days, where there were times where it was like, we can't do that because FDA won't allow us.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going, have we asked them specifically? Have we described what we're trying to do and asked them specific questions about it? And the response of no. And taking the time to pick up the phone and say, can I talk to somebody at the FDA about this specific, and getting connected and going, here's what we're trying to do. Here are the situations we're in. Can you help me think through, are there creative alternatives that we can, and actually opening up the possibilities of what really are the immovable objects that we can't move. I mean, there are certain things, like you said, GDPR, you deal with some of these things. There are certain requirements around where data has to live. You have HIPAA rules. There are certain things that you can't flex. But there's a lot of creativity in between that I see a lot of organizations cut off at the head before they've actually taken the time to dig into, well, given these are the restrictions. And I think going back to what we said earlier about the value of partnering with a vendor and saying, here's the landscape of where we're in. How could this work?
Yeah.
And let's troubleshoot that together. I've always found there are vastly more options available than most people realize.
Yeah, sometimes it's one little tweak, right? Like you're hitting on, you meet 95% of the requirements, and if you change one thing, now you can hit 100%. And yeah, you definitely don't want to pre-disqualify it. And I'd say too, I think technical people tend to kind of have blinders on sometimes when it comes to this, because we are so used to kind of thinking black and white. And I've had many experiences where I already pre-disqualified something, or I thought we couldn't comply or build a solution for a customer, and I've had other folks within my organization, sometimes it was the CEO or COO or a salesperson, really wanted to sell something, just push me. What if we did this way? What if we did it that way? Could we use this? And honestly, in many of those conversations, we found a solution. Whereas if me as the tech guy, like the robotic tech person, if I didn't have someone
ones and zeros,
yeah, if I didn't have someone pushing me, that would have been the end of it. But being pushed and having people ask questions just makes you think of things differently. And that is a great thing to have in an organization. And so if there's viewers that are out there that interact with tech people, don't think it's outside of your realm, and don't think that as the tech person, we don't need that. We do need that.
So I want to potentially close on this, because I think not close here, but actually dig into this a little bit, because this to me goes back to, and this underneath all of this, one of the red threads through this whole thing, which I think is beautiful, is the fact that we're talking about a set of skills that not only I think transverses functions, but also is critical in an age where everything's getting disrupted. And it's like some of these things we're talking about, I think, are extremely durable and will stand the test of time. But some of these things you just talked about here of pressing into that. But my experience has been there's a way you can do that can really piss someone off and set them apart as an adversary to you.
Yeah.
And there's a way you can do that makes it clear, hey, I'm not trying to say I know more than you. I'm not trying to dismiss your credibility. I'm just saying, instead of saying, why can't we do it? How can we explore this in what could we do? Hypothetically, like, let's problem solve this together. Being on the technical end where you said, I actually enjoy people doing that. I guarantee there are times in your career where you've gone, I haven't enjoyed when this person did it.
Oh yeah, of course.
Are there any things that stand out in that have, to folks who are listening who go, because I get it, I hear it from folks. They're like, well, I've tried and I just keep getting told no. And to give them some guidance on, well, maybe try this in a different way, because that's what I found. Again, going back to my problem solving skills, it's like I hear a no and I'm like, okay, that's a no. And maybe sometimes it truly is a no, but maybe it's I need to reframe it, or I need to think differently about it, or I need to come around it a different way. Have there been any things that have really helped when you're on that receiving end?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And, the more technical folks are a unique breed, and the more technical, the more I would say in some cases the social skills can suffer a bit, myself included, I would say. But I think a lot of it just comes down to how, and I think you mentioned before, just having a mutual respect,
Yep.
and if you're trying to beat a tech guy at a girl at their own game, yeah, there might be some ego engaged there. But if there's a mutual respect, person to person, listen, man, I'm just trying to, I really want to get this deal closed. It would mean a lot to me. What could we do? I've also found that being persistent is good. I mean, I've had situations where I think I've just sort of given a few quick no's without actually thinking, and then they keep coming back. And then I'm like, all right, let me really think about this now, because they're not going away. And you think of something,
Well, and so
there's a
go for it.
knee-jerk reaction. A lot of nope, can't do it. No, tried it 5 years ago, it didn't work. Nope. Go past that.
Well, and I think what's funny about that is I completely resonate with what you said, because I see how that happens and I understand it. Personally, I have a lot of empathy for my technical partners, and really not even just my technical partners, all my stakeholders. There's lots of times where I recognize I go and ask for something, or I'm trying to do something, and the knee-jerk reaction is no. And it's not, I don't like it. And I think for me, I've learned being durable and not taking it personally and saying, all right, look, this is probably a no because they've got a million other things on their plate, and they've probably been asked by a million other people for stupid things that they haven't thought through. And so just instinctively, it's like, no. And I've actually talked to people who go, I just say no the first time. I'm not recommending this, but they say no the first time just to see if the person's actually going to follow up with them. Because if they don't, they just go, well, it obviously wasn't that important. Because if they didn't take the time to actually follow up and, set time on my calendar or push forward, it must not have really been that big of a deal. And sometimes even just the act of persistence, which you hit on, of in a non-threatening way. I'm not here to challenge you or question your credibility or your knowledge. I'm just saying, here's the situation I'm in. I would just love to make sure we've explored this fully and considered it, and not giving up on that. Man, the number of times that's gone to another level with the combination of having a relationship, making sure they understand who I am, that, what I'm trying to do, type of a thing, you can go pretty far and get some things done that people would say, well, that's impossible. And it's like, no, it's a lot more possible than you realize.
Yeah, and listen, just the skill, if you want to call it a skill, of being persistent. If you think about it, if you're in that sales role and you're being persistent to your back end, tech person, see if you can deliver something. You're probably also persistent with your potential customers and in other areas of your life, and it's probably serving you well. And also, keep in mind, tech folks generally like beer. So, bribing them with beer is another strategy that probably will work to an extent.
There you go. There you go. Well, the one, so beer, we got that on the list. So for anybody listening, there you go. You can do beer. The mutual point, and I put this together in a video I did recently talking about the importance of human connection and how much that matters. And the number of times I've been able to get things through because I took the time to invest in building a relationship with someone that wasn't transactional. Like, I don't only talk to you because I need something from you, but I've gotten to know you as a person. And because I've now related to you because, oh, you skateboard, I skateboard, we have this relational thing. And now there's something that builds a mutual connection that, I hate to say, short circuits things, but it does change the pathways and opens up opportunities that weren't there before.
Oh yeah, so much so. I mean, my network is probably the best asset I have as a technical person. And years, you'll never know how that will serve you years later, but somehow it always does.
It always does. And to your point, though, and what we've been talking about, it's more than a transaction. It's not just, oh, well, I've got this many people that I have in my contact list or that I've encountered, but actually invested in and built that. So anyway, I told you we'd go over, but this was fantastic. And I really appreciate you being here, Sagi. And this was a great conversation. Hopefully for folks listening, this has made you think differently, not only about the skills, but also the way you engage and approach more technical parts of things, because I only think this is only going to grow. The world is growing more and more technical. And I think this becoming a key part of your job, regardless of where you work, is mission critical. So thank you so much. And I appreciate you making the time.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. And we will see you next week.